Moving on to our next theme today, we'll address the topics of attacks and censorship in connection with the issue of journalists under pressure. I'm delighted to welcome Mrs. Lina Kushch, who worked as a regional correspondent for over 20 years before she got elected as first secretary of the Ukrainian Journalists. Her personal goal, working on the defense of freedom. So welcome, Mrs. Lina Kushch.
Yeah. Thank you, Lena. Dear Dr. Ressman, dear participants, I appreciate you for giving me the floor to express my view on this very important issue and provide you with an update of ongoing activities of our union. Let's start with my presentation. I would like to start with the breaking news about things happened yesterday. Darnitsky district court in Kyiv banned the distribution of the journalist and historian Vahtan Kipiani's book Vasil Stus case. Court demanded from author of the book and publishing house to take down any sayings about Viktor Medvedchuk, MP and pro-Russian politician and head of political council of the party, the opposition platform for life in Ukraine. Politician filed a lawsuit to protect honor and business reputation, and the court ordered to take down any saying about the politician. Vasil Stus was a famous Ukrainian poet, journalist, and member of the Ukrainian dissident movement. His works were banned by the Soviet regime, and he spent 13 years in detention until his death in Perm in the camp for political prisoners in 1985. By the way, Vasil Stus studied at the university in Donetsk, in my former Stalin, in my family city, and my mother studied with Vasil Stus at the university too in 50th years of 19th century. As an advocate, Viktor Medvedchuk defended Stus during this trial, and the journalist wrote that the defender wasn't interested in this case and didn't protect Vasil Stus. In the closing speech, the defense stated all of Stus' crimes deserved punishment according to the author of the banned book. Now politicians ask to recognize some of the information in the book as unreliable, in particular 9 phrases. This is just a small touch, one example of pressure on freedom of opinion in modern Ukraine. I can remember any other case when during the last 30 years when a Ukrainian book will be banned by Ukrainian court, but we have get this case yesterday. Also, the court decision is not the final, and the journalist and publishing house are going to appeal it. There was a flash mob started on the Ukrainian segment of Facebook yesterday. Many users wrote words of support to the journalist, posted a photo of the book. The popular online media Ukrainskaya Pravda published 2 chapters from the book, which contains information that the politician demands to be removed. This case of unprecedented pressure on a journalist and historian takes place against the backdrop of the election campaign. A local election will be held in Ukraine on this Sunday. while journalists were attacked this spring because they because they covered lockdown violations before the elections, journalists are attacked because of their coverage of the campaign. The level of physical aggression against journalists in Ukraine remains consistently high. A special monitoring index of physical safety of journalists in Ukraine, which conducts by the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine and our organizations, partner organization, recorded 89 cases of physical aggression in 17, 86 in 18, and 75 in 19. Unfortunately, the majority of criminal proceedings are closed by the police, and in other cases, the length of the investigation is delayed for years, or the guilty are given soft sentences in the courts. For example, a penalty in 1 or 2 euros. Since the beginning of the years, we have 56 incidents of physical aggression against journalists in Ukraine, and 7 incidents were fixed in September. Most of these attacks can be attributed to political investigation in the election campaign in the regions caused by the local election. For example, on September 5th, the head of the Anti-Corruption Human Rights Council news agency, Alexander Snisa, was severely beaten in Dnipro. He was seriously injured and spent some time in intensive care. Journalists from regional TV channel were not allowed to attend the party meeting in Kremenchuk in Poltava region. Women journalists from online media Nikvesti in Mykolaiv tried to enter the office of the Territorial Election Commission, and a representative of one of the candidates started pushing her and telling to leave the room because of there was a wet cleaning. The journalist hit her head and back on the door. As usual, the investigative journalists are the object of attacks. On the night of August 17th, a care of the scams Corruption in Details program, a joint project of Radio Liberty and UI Pershi, was set on fire near the house of the driver of the film crew. 2 weeks earlier, journalists and employees of this film crew of this program reported systemic pressure. In particular, they found signs of wiretapping in the apartment of journalist Mikhailo Tkach. Undue pressures and harassment against journalists often leading the limitation or even the suppression of this dissemination of public interest information and self-censorship are still occurring among journalists in Europe, say the new book titled A Mission to Inform, Journalists at Risk Speak Out, published last week by Council of Europe. I would advise to find this book. It based on in-depth interviews with 20 journalists from 18 countries, including Ukraine. Our country represents Andriy Kulikov, journalist from Hromadske Radio and the head of Commission of Journalist Ethics. Journalists may encounter police intimidation and legal harassment. smear campaigns and bullying offline, but more recently online, as we hear from Ms. Sokolova. Pressures from politicians and editors, and economic pressures exerted by media owners and sponsors. Journalists also face detention, threats, and physical violence. We have examples from all this treatment in Ukraine. It's important to say about the journalists who are persecuted in the occupied territories in Crimea and in the occupied part of Donbas. The work of Ukrainian journalists is prohibited there. Citizens, journalists provide independent information about what is happening in the occupied territories for the Ukrainian media, because professional journalists cannot chance to be allowed to work on that territories. Citizen journalists also at great risk because they have no accreditation for work, for maybe make photo or for make a video on the streets. Since 2014, over 30 journalists have been released from captivity in Donbas. It's according the according to the information from Ukrainian Secret Service for our question from National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. These are official figures, but we believe that the real figures are at least 4 times higher. For example, at the end of last year, 2 journalists, Stanislav Asiev and Oleg Galazyuk, were released in Donetsk. They spent 2 years in jail, were severely tortured by pro-Russia administration because of their stories about life in the occupied territories. For the last 3 years, the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine actively insisted on holding parliamentary hearings on the safety of journalists. Such parliamentary hearings took place in November last year. Following the hearings, recommendations were adopted for the authorities, law enforcement agencies, and the court. However, the recommendations are being implemented very slowly. Only 1 in 10 of the total number of open criminal proceedings brought to court. Our union was involved in the preparing of the new legislation draft for stricter penalties for attacks on journalists. This draft registered last week in Parliament, but it's difficult to imagine when our MPs will be able to start considering the law, because they have gathered for a plenary session today and may not meet again until the end of year. Due to the fact of that 60 MPs are sick for COVID-19. However, these strengthening national legal mechanisms for responding to and preventing physical aggression against journalists in Ukraine is highly important. The other ways are creation of a parliamentary control over the safety on journalists in Ukraine, and including the issue of journalist safety in the permanent agenda of politicians and society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lina Kushch, for this presentation. There is already one question for you. It was written by Anastasia into the chat. I'm going to read it out loud. What do you think? Is it a democracy that pro-Russian influence of Medvedchuk in Ukraine is still existing as a different opinion? or is it manipulation that government continues to ignore?
Yeah. Thank you for this question. I think that pro-Russia media controlled by pro-Russia politicians, they registered, officially registered in Ukraine as Ukrainian media. So I think we should get the any reaction from government or from law force branches. What are these media? Are they the propaganda media, or are they Ukrainian media? But we are concerned about highly influence of oligarch on the TV channel in Ukraine. Not only it's not only about pro-Russia channels controlled by MP Medvedchuk, but about other channels controlled by the other oligarchs.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kushch, for this presentation.
Thank you.